Crimson opened his eyes, noticing that he was not alone. Applejack was still there doing something to his body, and it didn't take long to figure out what she was doing. A sharp pain surged throughout Crimson's body as she stuck a needle with some sort of metallic thread attached into one side of the open wound down his chest. He screamed, but only for a second, seeing the pain was not as severe compared to the many other things Applejack had already done to him. She noticed that he was awake and didn't hesitate to silence him, due to his struggling making the stitching process difficult.
"Don't struggle,"
she warned, giving him a very stern look in the eyes. Crimson knew he didn't have a choice, so he did his best to keep himself calm. Applejack continued with the stitching. "What are you doing to me?" asked Crimson in a weak tone.
"What does it look like? I'm closing you up. We need more blood, and leaving this open would cause infection, making y'all useless,"
she said annoyingly. Crimson looked down his chest, noticing the deep cut Applejack had made nearly stitched shut. The stitching job looked as if it had been done by an amateur doctor, meaning it was only temporary. Through his weak vision, he managed to mutter out some words as Applejack continued the stitching. "Why don't you just kill me?" he asked, staring at the grinder just below him.
"Because that would be no fun, sugar,"
replied Applejack. "Fun? How could this possibly be fun? You used to be a positive influence to every pony, and now they fear you."
"Trust me, sugar. If you had a taste of it, you want more."
"I would never torture my own kind, nor kill them so I could continue to make money off of an applesauce. I'd find another way." Applejack was growing tired of Crimson's yelling.
"You best keep your voice down, or I'll give you that special punishment again,"
she threatened. Crimson knew what Applejack was talking about, so he kept his voice down, while Applejack finished up her work. Once she was finished with the stitching, she turned to him. "Why are you looking at me like that?" he asked.
"Well, we gotta get you cleaned up for dinner,"
she replied. Crimson was confused. "Dinner?" he said, confused.
"Y'all will be joining the rest of us for dinner, sugar,"
she concluded. Crimson saw this as an opportunity to escape, knowing that the dinner that Applejack was referring to wasn't anything delicious, only disgusting. Applejack could read him so easily, knowing what he was thinking.
"Trust me, sugar. You'll be far too weak to even try any sort of escape. Your limbs will be so weak you won't be able to walk, so I'll be escorting you to the dining room. Think of it as a date."
Crimson's hopes were dashed, realizing Applejack was correct. He had no feeling in his limbs, especially his front legs, seeing the blood flow had been cut off to them. To add to the torture, he had no interest in being escorted by a monster, an escort that Applejack had described as a date. The thought of him dating a monster made him shiver.
"I'll grab some sponges along with some water, and we'll get y'all cleaned up, sugar,"
clarified Applejack. Crimson nodded his head, knowing it was best not to argue with Applejack, watching her as she walked down the stairs out of sight. Once he heard the door shut below him, he immediately knew that if he was ever going to get out, now was the time to come up with a plan. Not much time remained before he would be going through the grinder. He immediately pondered over his options of escaping, knowing the time was short. He was too weak to speak, so he thought of ways to escape deep in his mind. The only thing he could think of was somehow managing to weaken the restraints, but they were on him tight, and were replaced whenever a new victim came into the slaughterhouse. Through his desperation, he attempted to loosen the metal restraints binding his front hooves. His front hooves were far too weak to even move, so he resorted to his back hooves, containing more strength than his front hooves. He lunged them forward with every bit of strength he had left, ignoring the aching in his limbs. He continued to lunge his back hooves, praying that the metal restraints would weaken or budge. But unfortunately, the restraints were too strong. He needed more strength. Even if he did, he was unsure if he would be able to even weaken the restraints. They were stuck to the wall tight, forged to remain there the entire time a victim was locked in them. He stopped lunging, hearing the door below open. Applejack had returned with a bucket of water and a blood-soaked sponge. Looking up at Crimson, she noticed he was sweating, and due to her dealing with multiple victims in the past, she knew what he had been trying to do.
It's probably best you didn't manage to break free. You would have went head first into the grinder. That would have been a shame.
Applejack gave Crimson a deadly look, impersonating the sounds of what would have happened if Crimson would have managed to break free and fall into the grinder. The sounds made him shiver, wondering if it was best that he didn't break free.
Sorry, but it's never that easy, sugar. Now, time to get you cleaned up,
she said, dipping the dirty sponge into the water. Applejack placed the sponge along Crimson's body and started washing away the dry streams of blood from the wounds. "Why?" questioned Crimson.
Didn't I already tell you the answer?
She replied. "No. Why did I lose so much blood?" he claimed. "The amount of blood that I lost was far more than I should have lost." Applejack gave him a grin, continuing to clean around the wounds.
Oh, remember those pancakes I fed you? Well, a strong blood thinner we used on most victims was in the batter that caused your blood flow to increase massively. That's why y'all lost that much blood. Did you really think those were normal pancakes? You'll make me laugh, sugar.
Crimson was shocked and knew he had to be careful. Nothing was safe as long as he was here, and somehow he had to get out. Once Crimson was cleaned up, Applejack proceeded to unlocking his limbs from the wall, knowing he was far too weak to do anything. First, she released his front hooves, falling like rocks. They were floppy, and to Crimson felt as if they were made out of gelatin. He couldn't even feel his front hooves, nor support himself, so it was clear Applejack had him trapped. Next came his neck, which didn't feel any different, but Crimson's breathing increased and didn't feel as constricted. His back hooves were last, as he fell like a stone, but Applejack made sure he didn't fall into the grinder, wrapping him up with her lasso and covering his head, the sack.
Can't have you seen where the X's are now, can we?
Said Applejack, dragging Crimson down the stairs, hearing his back hooves hit each step, causing them to ache. Once they were on solid ground, Applejack placed him on all four hooves, struggling to keep him up. To keep him balanced, she placed his left front hoof over the back of her neck and escorted him into the Apple family dining room as if Crimson were her date. In the dining room, Crimson could hear the sounds of hooves against the wooden floor as Applejack settled him into a chair. She didn't lock his front hooves into restraints, but his back hooves were locked against the front legs of the chair. It was clear he wasn't going anywhere, and he was trapped in a dining room full of killers. Applejack lifted the sack from his head, only for him to see that he was seated at the far end of a wooden table, with each dinner plate covered with a metallic lid. Seated to the left of him was Applejack's older brother, Big Macintosh, staring at him with an evil grin. To the right was Applejack, and at the opposite far end of the table was Granny Smith, humming a tune of some sort. The sight of the murderous ponies was terrifying, and nearly made Crimson urinate all over the chair.
First, I'd like y'all to welcome our special guest, Crimson Flash. He is also my date, seeing that he loves his sweet Applejack very much,
said Applejack.
Y'all have never been very good with dates. Every time you bring one to the table, they seem to disappear, said
Granny Smith.
This one's different, Granny. He's special and does love me. Don't you think, Big Man?
Yep.
Well, now that every pony's here, we are going to play a game. The rules are that no pony gags or spits out their food. Otherwise, there will be consequences,
claimed Applejack. The sound of this game Applejack was referring to was reminding Crimson of the previous night, but he knew that the consequences had to be more severe. He took deep breaths, knowing that this was going to be difficult.
The consequences will get worse the more some pony gags or spits out the food. The first punishment will be a simple cut in any place the ponies choosing except the neck, because the neck is no fun. Second punishment will be an even deeper cut in the place of my choosing, and if the pony screams, the cut will deepen. Third punishment will be a brand of the Apple family's official brand to the forehead. Fourth punishment will be a brand to the left side of the face. Fifth punishment will be a brand to the right side of the face. Lastly, the sixth punishment will be a 50-50 choice, which will be 1, spend the night in my room and allow me to do anything to you, or 2, a trip through the grinder.
Crimson's eyes bulged at the sound of the last option, and now he knew this is how all the victims went, after multiple tortures. Crimson didn't know what to think, as Applejack yelled the words that would begin the sealing of his fate.
"Soup's on, everybody!"
Yelled Applejack, starting to lift the lids off the platters, only to reveal horrid-looking content. Crimson wanted to gag, but managed to keep himself under control. "Hold it together, Crimson," he said to himself. "Hold it together." The first platter was placed before each of them, which looked like some sort of animal.
"First serving, roadkill,"
stated Applejack. Crimson nearly gagged, but once again controlled himself. He grabbed the provided fork and knife and cut into the horrid meal, only to see pus leak out of the opening, and only got worse as he tore off a piece, revealing the insides of the dead animal. Pus gushed out, along with some maggots, and a horrid smell that burned every nose hair within his nostrils. He couldn't hold it back anymore and gagged to the point of where he threw up all over himself. The smell and texture of the meal caused him to vomit again, soaking the floor and plate with his own stomach content. Applejack rose from her chair with nothing but anger in her eyes. She stood next to him.
"Now, is that any way to act at the dinner table? You won't eat it!"
she yelled. Applejack violently lunged Crimson's head forward, straight into the roadkill, hearing the gushing of the pus and the stiff flesh of the animal break like a bone. He gagged massively and vomited into the animal's body, feeling the maggots and pus against the inside of his mouth. It tasted unlike anything Crimson could describe, as the maggots, pus, and rotten flesh leached into his mouth. Applejack pulled his head back so far he was choking and gagging on the content in his mouth, then placed his head back into its normal position, immediately starting to gag.
"You swallow that food! It took Great Smith all day to cook that!"
commanded Applejack. Crimson attempted to chew the content, but his gag reflex was too strong, and immediately puked again, lunging the horrid content back onto the plate, along with the vomit.
"How dare you disrespect my family's cooking! Apologize!"
she commanded. Crimson couldn't take it anymore, so he used his free hoof and gave Applejack a taste of her own medicine. He landed a nasty punch straight to her face and knocked her into the stove, accidentally planting the left side of her face on one of the burners. She screamed from the third-degree burn, singeing the entire left side of her face. Crimson had had enough and didn't care what was coming next. He was finished. Applejack raised her head from the burner and quickly looked at herself in a nearby mirror. The left side of her face was singed beyond repair, and now she literally looked like a monster. She turned to Crimson.
"Look at what you've done to me! I look like a monster!"
she yelled. "That's because you are one!" stated Crimson. Applejack gritted her teeth and gave the final command, sealing his fate.
We played with him enough. It's time to fire up the grinder, because he's going through.
Crimson was scared, but at the same time, he didn't care. He'd be free of the torture and death. Big Macintosh stood up and walked out of the room, into the slaughterhouse to fire up the machine. Applejack walked up to Crimson, whispering into his ear.
You are going to pay for what you've done to me,
she said, as she undid the restraints from his back hooves. She was not gentle with him, dragging him into the slaughterhouse as Big Mac fired up the machine. Crimson listened as the machine erupted to life. The conveyor belt started moving, and the sounds of the rotating blades erupted from above where he was originally bound to the wall. Applejack carried Crimson up the stairs until they were right before the entrance of the machine. The blades rotated as Applejack lifted Crimson up head first before the rotating blades and drew his face closer to the grinder. Just as he was about to be eaten up by the blades, the machine came to a sudden stop.
Big Mac, what are you doing?
She yelled.
It was me!
Stated Granny Smith, who had commanded Big Mac to shut off the machine.
Granny, why are you stopping me from pushing this garbage in the trash where it belongs?
Questioned Applejack.
We need to talk about something. It's important. Calm yourself. Get him back on the wall. And get back into the house,
said Granny Smith with a stern voice. Applejack did not like this, because right now she just wanted to see Crimson dead. But she knew she could not argue with Granny Smith.
Fine!
She exclaimed, turning Crimson's head to where she was face to face with him.
You got lucky this time, but next time you won't be so lucky.
Applejack grabbed Crimson and placed him against the wall once again, locking his limbs in the restraints. Once she finished locking Crimson to the wall, she proceeded out of the slaughterhouse, back into the house with a loud slam. Back in the house, Big Mac and Granny Smith were seated at the table. Applejack wasn't pleased, seeing her once beautiful face was now scorched for the rest of her life. She wanted Crimson dead.
Why did you stop me from killing that trash?
Asked Applejack. Granny Smith gave Applejack a stern glare, causing Applejack to calm down and take a seat.
We need him, Applejack. He could be the key to keeping our production going for the rest of our lives and beyond, due to the number of victims getting smaller,
stated Granny Smith.
What the hell are you talking about?
Asked Applejack.
I'm talking about keeping our family alive for generations, and seeing I'm not the day and age to even have children anymore, I'm making a proposition for you, Applejack. It's against our family's heritage to breed with another family member, so I figured that y'all could use a Crimson feather as your ace breeder. You've always wanted a young feller to love, right? Well, now you got one, and you just nearly turned him into nothing but muck.
Applejack liked and hated the proposition, seeing Crimson had just made her look like a monster. It was tempting, so she decided to add a few conditions of her own.
So your plan is to have me breed with Crimson and produce foals, so our family can grow and never die?
She asked.
Correct.
Assured Granny Smith.
Tempting, but I have a few conditions, seeing Crimson is more tricky and rebellious than others I've tortured in the past.
What are the conditions?
Asked Granny Smith.
I get to torture him in any way of my choosing, including the forbidden ways. I'm left alone while I do the breeding, and the first foal I ever have is slaughtered. He must suffer some way for what he did to me, and if going through a grinder isn't the way, let it be him seeing this old child die before his eyes. If you agree to the conditions, we have a deal, Granny.
Granny Smith did not agree to some of the conditions, mainly the forbidden tortures. She had no choice, though. Therefore, she gave the final verdict.
I agree with the conditions, Applejack. Start first thing tomorrow.
Agreed Granny Smith.
Absolutely.
The night was long, as Crimson continued to try and weaken the restraints, seeing that that was his only option. Tomorrow, it would be his turn to die, so if he had any hope of escaping, he had to do something, and fast. Even if he managed to get out of the restraints during the sleeping hours for the Apple family, he would not be safe. Not by a long shot. First, he'd have to escape the slaughterhouse, then would come the next step before he was even safe. he'd have to escape the Apple residents that guarded the outskirts of Ponyville. The Apples worked like a wolf pack, and Applejack was the alpha mare, while the others were just pawns. Crimson had never encountered the other Apple family residents, but he had seen them before. The main apples that guarded the outside of Ponyville were Apple Fritter and Brayburn. Apple Fritter was quick and agile, while Brayburn was more intimidating and strong. No pony had ever escaped the outside of Ponyville, because each time they were stopped. Apple Fritter and Brayburn made the perfect alliance, wits and strength. What came after them was unknown to every pony. For hours on end, he attempted to loosen the restraints, and still, it had not felt like he had even managed to weaken the steel. His limbs were aching from putting pressure against the steel, but he knew he had to stay strong, otherwise he was dead. He was exhausted, but had come close to death today, and was only saved by some faraway angel giving him a second chance. The madness within Ponyville had to end somehow, and the only way to get help was to somehow escape this forsaken prison born from greed and desire. After a whole night of struggling to break free, Crimson's heart dropped to the sight of sunlight peeking through the cracks of rotten barnwood, meaning that his time had come. Despite his effort, the Apple family had won, and another innocent pony would be imported into the slaughterhouse as soon as he was grinded up and put into the applesauce, just like many other countless victims. As much as he hated to know that another one of his Ponyville kin would be put through the torture he had experienced, he had to face facts. His day had come, and soon Applejack would come to seal his fate. He decided to try one last time and lunged his limbs forward, praying for the constraints to weaken. His attempt failed once more, and the metal restraints were not even budged. Crimson was exhausted, tired, and weak. He wanted to die, and knew he would soon. Yet, he had a feeling that Applejack would have much more than just a simple trip through the grinder planned. He knew she was going to make his final moments the most miserable moments of his life. About an hour later, the door below creaked open, meaning Applejack had arrived. Her hooves clamped against the hard floor, up the stairs. As she arrived at the top of the stairs, the left side of her face was bandaged, and she was dressed in an unlikely outfit designed to make her look attractive. But Crimson knew there was nothing attractive about Applejack. She was evil to the core. The bandages didn't surprise him, but the outfit she was in did. "What's up with your getup?" he asked. "Do you do this with all your victims before they all go through the grinder? Try to seduce them?" Applejack just ignored him, and grabbed a whip she had brought. Crimson had no idea what was going on, but he didn't expect any different. "What are you waiting for, you dirty mare? Get it over with!" he yelled. Applejack giggled, holding the whip in her mouth.
Y'all ain't going through the grinder,
she said in a low voice. Crimson was immediately confused. "What are you talking about? I thought you wanted me dead."
I did. That was until Granny Smith convinced me otherwise. She offered me a proposition I just couldn't refuse, seeing it gives me some pony to love, and lots of other gamings that benefit me,
she said. Crimson was starting to shake as Applejack continued her explanation.
It was perfect. Too perfect to pass up! You and me, Crimson, together for eternity, helping the Apple family grow!
Crimson was starting to understand, but he still didn't understand the full price of Applejack's proposition. "Please, just kill me," he pleaded. Applejack placed her hoof upon his bruised cheek.
I can't do that. Not when you are my ace stallion to breed with for the rest of our lives,
she said, beginning to draw in closer to Crimson. Crimson's heart stopped from the sound of Applejack's words as he started to feel her caress against him. It was just like the first time. Crimson knew that the worst was coming, and he didn't want to ever face that torture again. Now done, Applejack started to get herself into position. Crimson started to struggle more violently than he did the entire time he was here, hoping for a miracle to happen. Applejack started to move back towards his body as Crimson started struggling harder, feeling the walls start to shake. Applejack was inches from him when suddenly the restraint on his right back hoof came clean off the metal wall. He had a free limb, and just before she could connect, he landed a hard kick with his free hoof straight to Applejack's rear. And before she could become aware of the situation, she was lunged forward into the non-mobile grinder head first. The kick was hard enough to push Applejack's entire head through the row of blades. Crimson knew he had an opportunity to escape now that the grinder was blocked, and Applejack was struggling to get herself out. The weight of his free limb was pulling down on his whole body, so he quickly thought of his options of escape. He couldn't just slide out of the metal, seeing his limbs were stuck tight, and he couldn't reach or grip the key on Applejack's belt. He only had such little time to get out, so he couldn't wait to build up a sweat to try and slide out. He knew what he had to do, and it was going to cost him more than one hoof. Crimson braced himself as he pushed his body away from the wall with every bit of strength he had. The metal restraints started to dig into his flesh and limbs, causing him to start bleeding. The restraints dug into his skin, past the meat covering the bone, and as much as he was screaming, he knew this was the only way. The metal dug into the bones of his hooves, and being so close to escape, he was running out of strength. He wasn't going to let his only chance of escape fail, so using his free limb, he pushed his body away from the wall, digging the metal into the bone, and with one final thrust using his free limb, one of his front hooves snapped. The pain of the snapping limb made him scream and cry as he pushed more and more into his broken limb, planning to sever it. It took 3 hard lunges, but finally his front left hoof was free and bleeding profusely. The weight of his body had increased, but he needed more, so he did the same process with his other front hoof until it too severed clean off. Blood leaked out of the open wounds as he fell forward onto Applejack's back, snapping her spine. Using his mouth, he grabbed the key from her belt and managed to unlock his back hoof from the restraint. Struggling to stand straight, he fell lightheaded, but now was not the time to pass out. He had to get out. He took a hard tumble down the metal stairs, seeing his front hoofs were now gone, and only bleeding like crazy. He'd die of blood loss if he didn't get them covered soon. So he stood back up and made his way toward the barn door, but realized the moment was perfect. Applejack was finished, and now she was about to pay the ultimate price for her dirty deeds. Using the wall as a guide, Crimson made his way toward the switch that started up the machine, and listened as Applejack pleaded for his mercy. He only ignored her and stated something before finally pulling the switch. "Just like you, I'm not sweet. I'm as cold as ice," he said, starting the machine. Applejack's blood sprayed everywhere from the top of the machine as it ate her head alive. The sound of her screams were silenced in mere seconds, hearing the sound of only her skull cracking and her blood gushing throughout the machine as her head was severed clean from her shoulders. The machine continued to run, shredding away at whatever was left at the base of her severed neck. Blood continued to gush everywhere from the punctured arteries within her neck as her headless body finally went limp, and Applejack was gone forever. Crimson did not celebrate, only rushed into the Apple's residence, hoping to find something nearby that could close off the wounds he had. Inside, there was nothing except a running stove and a set breakfast table. There was not a single towel or anything that he could place over the wounds until he found a hospital. He had to think fast, seeing the Apple family could be back any time, and quickly found a solution, even though he would not like it. The burner on the stove would be able to stop the bleeding and close off the wound. Otherwise, he'd be easy to track because of his blood trail. He took a deep breath and placed one of his hooves along the surface of the burner, immediately feeling excruciating pain. He held it in place for about 10 seconds, making sure he closed off the wound fully. He did the same with the other hoof, starting to feel a bit nauseated. Despite the pain, he had to get out, so he ran back to the inside of the slaughterhouse, unlocked the barn door with the key he had taken from Applejack, and ran as fast as he could from the once welcoming Sweet Apple Acres. Crimson ran in the opposite direction of Ponyville, hoping not to run into any Apple locals. Luckily for him, there was no pony in sight, and he had managed to make it a great distance from Sweet Apple Acres. He hid away in a thick area where he could not be seen, and looked at his front hoofs that had been burned to a crisp. Many things ran through his head, both positive and negative. Was he truly out of the Apple family's clutches? How was he going to stop the Apple family's murderous cycle? Who could help him? All he knew is that he had to somehow get help from a distant place. Ponyville was the worst place to go right now, until he could get the right help. He refused to ever go back to that farm, ever again, and would not rest until the Apple family were put behind bars where they belong. Justice had to be done, for already too many lives had been taken. He knew he was not going to get anywhere until he had strength, so he made sure he was hid well, and closed his eyes into a long sleep. After escaping Sweet Apple Acres, it took 3 long days before Crimson was finally able to find help in a nearby town. No pony had ever known of the horrors that happened within the farm, just as the Ponyville inhabitants never knew until one spoke the truth. Apple Bloom is the one member of the Apple family that Crimson, along with every past victim, could accept, seeing she turned against her own family, even if it had cost her her life. Crimson was admitted into a hospital immediately, where he remained for several months, while the Royal Guard in Kennerlot was gathered to finally put the Apple family where they belonged. The Royal Guards infiltrated the farm, only to find every member of the family in a pool of their own blood. Once Crimson had escaped, it had violated a rule within the Apple family's heritage.
If any pony is to escape from the farm, all family members must commit suicide. We were brought into the world as one, and we all go as one.
After searching the farm, many disturbing things were found, such as victims' belongings, an entire cellar with jars full of pony blood collected from their tortures, and countless photos of the victims being tortured. There were also over 500 torture devices found in the family's farmhouse, including whips, countless knives, used gag devices, and 20 separate brands designed to mark the victims. A diary of each victim's experience was found in Applejack's bedroom, each one dated and described very violently. There were also items designed for hard intercourse found within Applejack's room, including spandex clothing, a spiked whip, and modified sex kits designed to torture the other pony. Other disturbing items included chunks of flesh cut from the victim's flanks, showing a brand AF on each, along with other organs including hearts, tongues, and other parts of the body that are best not to be mentioned. Books and charts stolen from Ponyville Hospital were found as well. This is how the Apple family knew how to torture some pony without killing them. The books and charts were given back to the hospital. However, they refused to take them, due to them being used for nothing but evil reasons. The items were confiscated as evidence in the most disturbing case ever recorded in Ponyville, the Apple Family Massacre. Brayburn and Apple Fritter were the only apples not to commit suicide. They were found just outside of Ponyville performing sexual acts and were arrested by the Royal Guard. Their sentence was life in Canterlot Prison with no chance of parole. The two were investigated as well, and all that was discovered is that both were having a secret relationship, which didn't help in the case, but was kept anyways. Sweet Apple Acres was investigated more, and what the Royal Guard found would seal the farm's fate. Stuffed victims were found within the walls of the farm, and from the autopsy reports were found to only be 10 years old, which was around the time when the Apple family's killing spree had started. The 20 victims found within the farm walls were proposed as the very first victims, just before the grinder was imported, and from the looks of the bodies, were tortured severely. Their cause of deaths were all the same: unknown. After the full investigation, Sweet Apple Acres was demolished to nothing, and is now a restricted area for any pony to enter. It is only a place of misery and torture, and is best to be left to rest. No pony has ever been to the area since the demolition, knowing that the Apple family was still there, waiting. As for the only survivor of the Apple family massacre, Crimson recovered from his injuries, but his life is far from normal. After experiencing a horror as great as the Apple family massacre, he couldn't live a normal life, traumatized from the torture he had faced. The young Earth pony lives in a quiet area of Ponyville and is having regular therapy sessions, hoping to recover from the true horror he had to live through. However, it returns each time he sees the branded AF on his flanks, a small reminder of his experience in the slaughterhouse. The following injuries are what he endured within the time he was trapped in the slaughterhouse: 4 broken ribs, 2 bruised ribs, a broken jaw, 4 lost teeth, 6 severely chipped teeth, a fractured nose, severe concussion, 2 fractured eye sockets, 3 lacerations, severe dehydration, severe burns to the flank area, a stomach infection, and 2 severed limbs. Countless surgeries were needed to make Crimson into the pony he is now. He is able to walk, eat, and talk normally, thanks to the help of some prosthetic hooves, 2 months of recovery from his surgeries, 6 months total to heal all the broken bones, and an estimated 10 to 12 years of professional therapy. The road will be hard for Crimson, but he's slowly getting back on his hooves. He is now married to a mare named Daisy Bloom and has a son and daughter. The horrors of the Apple family massacre remain with him, but with his wife and kids to look to, he is thankful that he never gave up and lived to tell the tale